Good morning, everybody, and thanks for making an 8 a.m. session. I'm not Steve Harrod, so I appreciate that. My name is Massimo Referè. A little bit of history, couple of slides for this presentation. Well, the disclaimer, you have seen this. We're not going to read it, but I'm going to touch on a few things that are future stuff. Obviously, the usual disclaimer applies here. So, as I said, a little bit of background about this session. I've been working 15 years for IBM, mainly doing VMware virtualization in a pre-sales, type of role. And life at that time was very easy because you would show a slide like this, and the audience would immediately go like, this, right? February last year, I joined VMware, thinking about, how good, all this stuff are, and they told me, you're going to do cloud, right? And they gave me a picture like this, and as soon as we started pitching this, the reaction from the audience was something like this, right? So bear with me, it's a very difficult topic to go through. What I would like to do with this presentation really is going through two main parts. One is just to try to give you an idea of why we are doing certain things, because we need to create the context about the things that we are going to talk about in the second part of the presentation. I personally tried to explain, things like, vCloud Director, vShield, and all this kind of stuff without creating this context. And the picture that I usually see is this one, It's, well, okay, but, right? So this is how basically it works, right? So I would love to spend 15, 20 minutes on the niche definition of the cloud, but we don't have time, right? So we go straight to other parts, which is, first of all, what you're hearing here is going to be just infrastructure as a service things, okay? So you know that, we have infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. I'm not going to bore you with, what that means, because you have kept hearing this for the last, 2-3 years. But basically, whatever you will hear in the next hour or so is going to be infrastructure as a service type of messages, okay? If you go to a vFabric PaaS type of session, you may hear different messages, okay, from what we are trying to do. The key here to remember is that we want to do something that would allow you, as the end user, to bring your legacy sort of application into the cloud, without having to rewrite them or things like that. That's the objective, okay? So the next set of slides are really going to create this context of why we're trying to do certain things, right? And this hidden slide just say that we want to try to be different from what other people are doing in terms of creating clouds, right? Specifically, I'm referring to other vendors, right? So the first thing to keep in mind is that when we were talking about virtualization, we were really talking about virtual machines, right? When we talk about vCloud and infrastructure as a services cloud, we specifically are talking about a different thing, which is a virtual data center, right? So we're not so much focused on creating virtual machine on demand, but we are very much obsessed in trying to create virtual data center that, end user can use in a number of ways that I show you, okay? So the other thing to keep in mind that goes back to the point that I was trying to make is that we want to be able, with our technology, to mimic what a physical data center is. And I'm saying this in a very positive way, because if we manage to do this, you will be able to bring your legacy application into the cloud without even noticing that, and gaining all the advantages of a cloud environment that we have seen before in the niche definition, okay? So the other point is that the UI is important, but we are focusing a lot on the APIs as well, okay? So we try to be different from others that are trying to pitch cloud as fundamentally a bunch of physical devices where you may use some server virtualization, basic stuff, for the compute part. But basically, the idea of a huge orchestrator monster that orchestrates all of these physical devices, with the objective of giving the end user through a web browser basically virtual machines. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. It could cover a nice use case for a cloud. But we're trying to do things a little bit different, okay? We're trying to leverage, of course, a lot vSphere, okay? So we want to use virtualization as much as possible and not just for the compute node, as other vendors are doing, for example, when you deploy these huge orchestrator things underneath. Oh, by the way, if I'm pausing or slowing down, it's a mix of this being an 8 a.m. session and being totally jet lagged, okay? So if I stop for a minute, don't worry, I'm okay. It's just that, I need to reboot internally, right? So basically, what we are doing here is pretty much this. The focus here is very much, not so much on virtual machine, as I said, but on a couple of other things, which are what we call the virtual data center, and we will get into those details in a moment, and the APIs. And we want to be focused on the APIs because we don't see the consumer of this type of infrastructure just being the end user that acts as a catalog. That is a use case, but we want to leverage this infrastructure to do things like enabling you to create a hybrid cloud, you being the end user, where you can subscribe to a public service provider, a virtual infrastructure provided by vCloud Director, and being able to merge your local infrastructure with a virtual data center that the public cloud provider does. And you can't really do this if the public cloud provider provides you with raw virtual machines. It needs to provide you with the raw compute capacity, right? So that you can bridge this. The other point that I want to point out on this slide is that at some point we faced the choice of what to do with the NetSec part, which is basically the firewalling, netting, and all those sort of things that are required obviously in the cloud. And we were facing basically the dilemma of, should we go out and orchestrate what's available, or should we do what we do best, which is virtualizing things? So we decided to virtualize these services as well, and that's how basically vShield was created. So if you ever wonder what vShield is, it's basically the virtualization of those physical services that are available in a standard infrastructure. But we know that you couldn't really build a cloud at scale just orchestrating the physical devices out there. You just need to do this to create an abstraction layer, which is essentially what we have done at the very beginning with the compute node, and then we are starting to do more with the storage and the network, as you heard in the keynotes. And we want to do this with the net security as well. Okay? So this is kind of to create basically the context here. The other thing is that obviously we're not the first to create a virtual appliance that does NAT and firewalling and this kind of stuff. We're not the first in the industry to do this. But the value of this stack here is the integration between all of those parts. Okay? So that's pretty much one of the value here. Okay? So let's get a little bit into this, the virtual data centers. What are they? Okay, and how we implement them. Okay, so this is a couple of slides that I showed last year, which basically try to tell to the vSphere administrator, because at the beginning of this session, I thought about this session about something like, we need to try to give the vSphere administrator an understanding of what we're doing and try to get them along the journey that we're taking here. So if you are a vSphere administrator or vSphere anyway, basically what happens here is that the relationship between the vSphere administrator and the end user is very much unbalanced against the end user. Basically, as a vSphere administrator, you can do pretty much everything at the infrastructure level, And then as the last step, you would give this VM to the end user that is going to RDP, SSH, or whatever into the VM and do whatever they want, right? And this is why I was saying that virtualization equals virtual machine, because this is what we have been doing in the last 7, 8 years, right? So from a vSphere perspective, when we talk about cloud and virtual data centers, we need to do something like this, right? We need to enable the end user not to access just one virtual machine, but to access a portion of this virtual infrastructure that I own as the vSphere administrator, right? Because I need to give them compute capacity, right, in terms of CPU, memory, disk, and this kind of stuff. I just don't need to give them, I don't want to give them just a virtual machine with an IP address, okay? So this is just to create the context of what we are trying to do here. So let's try to look at how a physical data center looks like now. Okay, we said that we want to create a virtual data center. Let's see how a physical data center looks like these days. I love this picture. I mean, I've been using this for years, and it tells a lot, I think. Right? So if you say, I mean, this is a typical data center at the end. So you have internet connectivity, right, that goes into your data center. Then you have security, like firewall, NAT, VPN, and this kind of stuff. And then you have, capacity in terms of, storage, CPU, memory, and all this kind of stuff, right? And then you have a console with an administrator here. And this is pretty much how it works, right? You have a pipe that comes in. You have some sort of edge security. Remember this word, because it is at the edge of the network. And then you have your data center, right, with a compute capacity where you are doing pretty much everything, okay? So how can we try to recreate this environment in a vSphere environment in a multi-tenancy way, okay? So, and this goes back to the title of this presentation, which is, trying to explain to the vSphere administrator what we are doing to create all these fancy things, okay? So I'm not going to discuss this at the bottom, because this is fundamentally your bread and butter, okay? You know it. It's vSphere, storage, data store, NICs, and all this kind of stuff, okay? So what does VCD add on top of that? It basically creates additional abstraction layers so that it's a many-step setup. If you go, oh, by the way, I didn't ask this, but by show of hands, how many of you have been playing with vCloud Director and get an understanding of what it does? I'm not just saying, I play with it and I don't understand it, okay? How many of you have played with it and are comfortable with what's going on in the back? By show of hands. It took me 6 months, by the way, so don't feel embarrassed if you don't raise your hand. Okay, good. Not so many people, which is what I would expect. So basically what we do when we layer our VCD on top of this is we do multiple steps. The first one is we kind of aggregate resources in what we call provider VDCs, okay? So basically you take, data store, clusters, resource pool, and all this kind of stuff, and you create what we call the provider VDCs that are, in a way, are service levels, okay? So the example is typically I want to create a gold provider VDC that has fiber channel storage. I want to create a silver provider VDC that has SATA storage, for example, okay? So the next step that happens within VCD is that we create what we call the organizations, okay? In the example here, I'm using Coke, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, so it reminds a public cloud environment, right? So this is how it would like for a public cloud provider where he's going to onboard Coke, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper. In a private cloud environment, this organization may look like something like, the various business units that you have internally to which you are associating capacity, for example, okay? So as I said, this is pretty much a public cloud environment type of example. We do have a number of things within each organization. So, for example, a catalog. role-based access control, and this kind of stuff. We can't get into the very details. I mean, this slide could explode, in an hour session alone, this slide alone. So I'm just trying to give you an idea of what happens when you lay VCD on top of this. And the next step is I have provider VDCs, I have organization, and then I need to add capacity to these organizations. So Coke has both a part of the gold provider VDC as well as a part of the silver provider VDC, because maybe they want to have production workload as well as non-production workload, so forth. Okay? The last step that you do, which we're going to explode in the next part of the presentation, is really how you give connectivity to these organizations. You remember how the physical data center looks like? We need the internet connectivity or the intranet connectivity if this is a private cloud type of environment. And that is where we use vShield to provide that connectivity. Okay? So these are at very large the step that you do when you implement vCloud Director. Okay? At a very high level. So this becomes that virtual data center, and that virtual data center is going to be accessible in self-service mode by, for example, Dr. Pepper in this example, either via web or through the APIs. And in a public cloud type of scenario like this one, the reason for which you want to expose APIs is, for example, if Dr. Pepper has a vSphere environment on premises and they want to extend it into the public cloud, what they could do is they could install vCloud Connector, for example, which would map the local resources as well as the public resources that this service provider is making available. And the way vCloud Connector works is it goes and talks to these APIs, and it will see this virtual data center that this service provider is making available. Okay? Good. So just to give you an idea of how these may work in a real-life environment and a use case, for example, this is a real story of a real customer, service provider in this case, but an enterprise customer at large scale would have probably similar problems, where there was, this big firewall protecting their physical data center that was basically doing two things. It was doing physical data center security at the edge of the physical data center network, as well as workload security. And what I mean by workload security is they did have different VMs for different either external customers, if it's a service provider, like in this case, real-life use case, or different business unit, if it's a private implementation, where everything was going through this internal consolidated, centralized firewall. And they had 93,000 firewall rules in this centralized firewall. And they said, this is pretty much unmanageable, right? So what we were doing and what we are trying to work on is a scenario which is completely different, and goes back to the point that I was trying to make before about the virtual data center, right? So this is a big mess fundamentally. What we're trying to do is something like this. So decouple the physical data center security. So we don't want to remove all the physical firewall, right? But we want to kind of reduce the complexity, leaving the physical data center security in that physical firewall, and create these virtual firewall that are supposed to create this virtual security for the tenants, okay? So at that point, those either business unit or customers would have their own organization. They would own their own virtual firewall, so that what happens is that these guys could do self-service into that virtual firewall. If they mess up this virtual firewall, I mean, nobody cares. I mean, other than them, of course, right? But in the picture that I was showing before, if they mess up the centralized firewall, they mess up pretty much everything, right? So in a public cloud scenario, this looks like, those virtual data center. The real advantage is the self-service mode that you can achieve using something like this, okay? So you give the virtual firewall access to the tenant itself so that they can configure the firewall, DHCP, NAT, and all this kind of stuff. In a private cloud scenario, this is a pretty different. So depending on the scale of the infrastructure and the enterprise customer itself, one of the reactions that we are usually having is, well, we are not operating at a scale where we have business unit with, talented IT people, let's say, in those business units. So they don't know what the firewall is and they don't know anything about IT infrastructure, right? So, but these guys are looking into this to continue to centrally manage those virtual firewalls. So it is always the cloud, the private cloud administrator that is managing those virtual firewalls because they don't want to give this access to the business unit itself. But it's a better way to organize things. It's a better way to solve that mass of 93,000 firewall rules that they had to manage centralized. Okay? Is there any question? Anything that you want to ask? So we kind of basically cover the why we are doing certain things. Okay? Is it all clear? No, okay. Can you talk on the mic so that everybody...
Just a quick question. With regards to virtual firewalls, there's this thing from physical firewalls. And physical firewalls, say Checkpoint as an example, you have really, really good logging, you have really good tools to look at the logs, do forensics and so forth. What kind of tooling and logging do you have with virtual firewalls?
So we know that obviously this is something that, I mean, it is very required, especially in a public cloud scenario where, you need a certain level of security, compliance, and so forth. The level of logging that we provide with the virtual firewall in self-service mode is probably not to the point where, we would like to be, let's put it this way, compared to what the other physical firewall engine can provide at the moment. But I mean, I don't want to get too much into the technical details. I mean, also I'm not very much expert in that security area, so I'm just trying to give you an overview of what's going on here. But of course, we don't do everything. As I said at the very beginning, we're not trying to, to map feature by feature the physical devices. We want to give a good enough experience to the end user in self-service mode so that they can do what they need to do without the service provider or the cloud provider internally or externally having to deal with the mess of managing physical devices. So that I know that it doesn't answer your question, but I mean, if you're looking for specific information about what we provide in terms of logging and this kind of stuff, we have just published what we call the vCloud Architecture Toolkit, which is a 700 pages, I guess, document that goes into the very details of all of these. And there are lots of details about all these logging things. I know that in 1.5 we introduced self-service for the logging, so the customer can look at the logs. How deep these logs are, I can answer that question.
It's just like other sessions I've been at, and my own experience, that when you get into things like PCI compliance and other things like that, security is very important.
No. I understand this. As I said, I'm not a security expert. I'm just trying to give you an idea of what's going on. We know that we have, stuff to do to improve the product and to do, better in this space. But we're trying to start doing this. Okay. Okay. So. As I said, I mean, this is just trying to create the context of, why we're doing certain things. And now we try to look at how we are implementing these things from a vSphere perspective. So what I'm trying to do here is to try to create a parallel of what you would see in vCloud Director and how that maps into vSphere. Okay? So this slide is pretty weird. But I needed to, to show you a slide like this, just to show you how we are going to talk about this. And this is really two different things. So part of the discussion here is network related, and we are going to touch very briefly on things like, VLAN, vCDNI, VXLAN, and what we were announcing yesterday. And the other part is really, on the network security, so firewall and all this kind of stuff, basically. Okay? And then at the end, we will try to put these together and see how you can combine things. Okay? I hope it will make more sense as we go through the deck. Okay? So we will start now with the network security. So how do we implement into that vShield schema security in a cloud environment? Okay? So let's start talking about vShield for a moment. Okay? Most of you may be, expert in vShield. Maybe you have looked into it, but maybe other people haven't. So just to set the stage here, vShield is the name or the umbrella that we use to define our, security products. Okay? At this point in time, we do have three major pillars, which are endpoint, app, and edge. Okay? We're not going to discuss endpoint because this is not really related to the cloud discussion that we are having here. We are going to discuss app and edge. Okay? These are two technologies that are delivered through the vShield technology umbrella and are managed by what we call the vShield Manager. So look at vShield Manager as the vCenter for security, in a way. Okay? So edge, as the name implies, is the device that we are using to create this security at the edge of the organization or at the virtual data center. App is another technology that we're using to provide security within the organization. Okay? So let's see how this works at the vSphere level. So from a networking perspective, we're just going to refer to layer 2 networks here. We will then discuss what that L2 network is in the other branch of the slide that I was showing you before. Okay? But right now, we say we have two L2 networks, A and B, and we want to create security between these two networks here. Okay? And we put a vShield Edge device between these two networks. Okay? So that we can have a security zone 1, security zone 2, VMs that are connected to these two zones and are protected by the vShield device, vShield Edge device. Okay? From a vSphere perspective, how does it work? The vShield Edge device is primarily a virtual appliance that kind of shortcuts two port groups. So basically, the idea from a vSphere perspective, if you go down and you see what is going on at the vSphere layer when you do all this fancy configuration at the VCD layer, you will see something like this. You will see two port groups because they define, with vShield Edge in this configuration, they define the layer 2 segment, and then you have a vShield Edge device that shortcuts those two port groups. A VM is connected to one port group, a VM is connected to the other, and the vShield Edge device kind of, protect the two VMs with each other. Okay? This is how vShield Edge works, and we will see how this fits into the picture of VCD later. vShield App is a different thing. So basically, vShield App is basically firewall functionality that is created within the distributed virtual switch. So basically, the high-level idea is that you have a single layer 2 network, let's say a port group, where you can create security zones through vShield App so that you can have a VM1 connected to that port group, VM2 connected to that port group, and you can enforce a firewall rules that says VM1 can talk to VM2 only on port XYZ. Okay? So this is how it works from a logical perspective. From a physical perspective, from a vSphere perspective, it's not very different. So basically, vShield App is a kernel module that gets installed on the ESXi host and allows you, through vShield Manager, to enforce that firewall rules between a VNIC and another VNIC of two VMs that are connected to the very same port group. Okay? So is this clear? I mean, vShield Edge, an appliance that shortcuts to port group. vShield App, it's basically a low-level kernel module that can say, this VNIC cannot talk to this other VNIC, even if it is connected to the very same port group. Okay? So let's see how this maps into vCloud Director. Okay? So you remember that we said we want to create this virtual data center, which is what you basically see on the left-hand side. And we want to create edge security for this virtual data center. So what happens here is that when you create this at the VCD layer through the interface or the APIs, basically you're connected what we call the external network, which for service provider may be the internet connectivity, for private cloud may be the internet connectivity. And then you have what we call the org network here, which is the organization network dedicated to that organization, which is protected by this vShield Edge device. Okay? And if you look how this maps into vSphere, it's basically what we said before. Okay? So you have a port group that represents this external network. So from an infrastructure perspective, that port group, if you are a service provider, for example, is associated to a VLAN, which is a pipe that goes out to the internet. And then there is another port group that gets created, which represents this organization network. Okay? So that you can connect a vApp or a VM to this organization network. Basically, what happens behind the scene is that you're connecting these to this port group. And another thing that you can do within vCloud Director in self-service mode as an end user through the UI or the API is creating what we call the vApp network, which is another layer of security within the vApp to say, I have a web server that connects to the org network, and then I have a database that I don't want to connect to the org network together with all the other machines. I want to have an additional level of protection for that database backend VM, and this is what happens. Within vCloud Director, you could create this vApp network protected by another vShield Edge device. And what happens from a vSphere perspective is that we automatically deploy another vShield Edge device that connects to another port group, which represents that vApp network. And the good thing is that this is all self-service in the sense that VCD will deploy these automatically for the end user. So you see some of these self-service characteristics so that if you are a service provider or a private cloud administrator, the end user doesn't have to call you to say, I need another VLAN, I need another rule, I need another. You can do pretty much everything, okay? From a self-service perspective. Another scenario that you can implement with vCloud Director is basically this one. So you still have this external network, and you can deploy more than one organization network and create, the network connectivity that you would like to, basically connecting, a web, a database, or, whatever you want to do in a physical environment. We are trying to mimic it in a virtual environment. This is what happens from a vSphere perspective. So basically, we are leveraging the very same pipe out to the internet in this very case, and we deploy two vShield Edge that are protecting these two different port groups here. Okay? So, yeah. Can you talk on the microphone?
So a vShield device can only have two legs?
I'm sorry?
A vShield device, an appliance, can only have two network interfaces?
They do have two legs, one that goes to the external network and the other one that goes to the org network. You would probably like to do something like this. Thanks for the question, as the Italian politician says. But yeah, so you would probably like to do something like this. This is a feedback that we hear probably 5 times a day. This is not possible today. Okay? Not today. Of course, there are plans to do, all of these things, but it's not available today. Okay? Good question, though. So you remember, we have been talking about vShield Edge, which fundamentally allows you to shortcut to port groups. And we have seen some use cases for this and how you could create these in vCloud Director and how this maps into VCD. Another interesting scenario would be doing something like this. So imagine an organization that has an organization network, which is the one that you see in blue here, where you need to create more security zone. So one of the approach could be what we have seen before in the other slides, so using edge to protect different layer 2 networks. Another approach that we basically introduced with vCloud Director 1.5, I don't want to get into the details. You could do this with 1.0, but there were big limitations. You can certainly do this with vCloud Director 1.5 and vShield 5.0. The interesting thing is that you can create what we call security enclaves on the very same port group, basically, because vShield app is going to basically allow you to create this security zone on that port group. Now, one drawback of this approach is that today, and I have slides that talk about this later on, today this is not integrated into the VCD interface. So if you want to do this, this needs to be a managed service, basically, because the vShield administrator have to configure these rules through the vShield manager. I have a slide that talks about this a little bit. Okay? So these are the kind of scenario for the security services. Okay? So we went through, what you could do with Edge, what you could do with app in this case. Now, let's go to the other side of the branches that I was discussing. You remember, we had security, Edge, app, and now the port groups. I mean, how do you keep these port groups separate? Okay? So basically, what does represent a layer 2 network for me? Okay? Pretty much a couple of things. A VLAN, so you create a port group and you associate a dedicated VLAN, and this is what we have been doing for the last, 5-6 years since we have introduced VLAN support in vSphere, probably more. And there is another way to do this, which is creating different layer 2 networks, which are still represented by port group, which is what we call vCloud Director network isolation. So let me go through some animation to show you these two things. I mean, this is a no-brainer, okay? You probably get this. Basically, you have a cable. You have VLAN support in the switches and in the infrastructure, and you create port group that maps those VLANs. In this example, I'm not sure if you can see this, but basically what we're doing here is we're creating 3 port groups, port group 1, 2, and 3, and we are associating VLAN 1, 2, and 3. These are distinct, separate layer 2 domains, okay? The other thing that we're doing, and we have been doing since Lab Manager, really, is we want to virtualize that VLAN. And the way it works is pretty much this. So you take this cable, you take a VLAN out of this cable, and then you would apply this technology to kind of multiplex that VLAN. Okay? So what happens in this case, from a vSphere perspective, and you probably need to know this if you just look at vSphere, is that basically we create, on top of the distributed virtual switch, we create 3 port groups, port group 1, port group 2, port group 3, that looks like they are the same layer 2, because they have just one VLAN associated. But what happens is that through a kernel module that implements this vCloud Director network isolation, we can actually create separate layer 2 networks within that very same VLAN. So that means that port group 1 is a broadcast domain, port group 2 is a different broadcast domain, and port group 3 is another different broadcast domain. Okay? So basically, what we're doing here is basically we are virtualizing VLANs here. Where have we seen this? We have seen this being a lifesaver for service providers that are approaching the 4,000 VLAN limits, and I've been working with many service providers that are very close to that limit if they haven't passed that already and they have been finding workaround around that, basically. And the other scenario is where you really want to disconnect from a physical network capability. So what happens, even in small environment, is that if you need to deploy a new port group with another VLAN, you have to connect to the network administrator to create the new VLAN across the switches and this kind of stuff. Customers that would like, even if they are not hitting the 4,000 limit, but they would like a little bit of disconnect between the network environment and the cloud environment from a network's perspective, they can use this technology to kind of accomplish that. Okay. I have a few slides later on VXLAN. Basically, VXLAN is, I'm not saying it's a follow-on to this, because we are going to have both for the foreseeable future. We're going to support both. But VXLAN basically builds on this idea of disconnecting VLANs from what you see within the cloud. Okay? Is that clear? Any question or? Okay, good. So let's try to put the things together, okay? I didn't know how to put these things together, so I just came out with what I called my magic quadrant, okay? I've been discussing this with Gardner, and we are clear with copyright and this kind of stuff. Now, I mean, this is really half a joke, but I wanted to try to give you an idea of how you can put these two things together, because what we have been discussing is a multi-dimension thing, right? We have been discussing networking and how you can, deal with the networking and port groups and layer 2 networks. And the other one is how you can deal with security, and we touch on edge and app, okay? So from a security perspective, what I usually say, and this is obviously my own interpretation, so I mean it's not just the official VMware message, but my interpretation is that really vShield Edge try to mimic what you're doing in a physical environment, right? Usually you have a firewall that has multiple VLANs, and you create firewall rules with those VLANs, right? So I call it kind of a legacy security model without any, negative, meaning. It's just the way we're doing things today in the physical world. The vShield app, I call it more like, a more innovative security model, because we can't really do this, well, as far as I know at least, in a physical world, right? You can't really have, this kind of stuff in a physical world. And on the other hand, I mean, we have the network, as we discussed this, and I usually say that the VLAN represent what we call the static network infrastructure, because this is what we have been doing, and this requires, a certain level of interaction between the network guys and the server guys, and that needs to come together in terms of, an end-to-end configuration of the whole infrastructure. What I call the VLAN virtualization, which today is vCDNI and tomorrow is more like things like VXLAN and this kind of stuff, is more like an agile type of networking environment where you can really forget about how the physical network is set up in terms of VLAN and this kind of stuff, and do all you want to do from a virtual perspective within the cloud environment, within the vSphere environment, or within the vShield Manager environment, okay? And this is how the two things come together, right? So as you will see in the next 4 or 5 slides, you can really mix and match all of these technologies. So for example, you can use a mix of VLAN back port group and edge, but you can be very, very aggressive, which is the last, probably the fourth or the fifth slide that I'm going to show you. You can become very aggressive in the way you adopt this innovative technology using, for example, VLAN virtualization and app, right? And then you have other options like using VLAN back port group and app, or VLAN virtualization with edge. Okay? So it's basically impossible to show all of the mix and matches that you can do, but I wanted to just give you an idea of how you can build this. So, for example, you can have your external network that is on VLAN. Okay, VLAN 1 is not a good example, okay, but it's just to represent VLAN 1, 2, 3. It could be whatever. VLAN 1 is not a good example, actually. But it should give you the idea of this being a tenant, an organization, and what you could do in a very basic way, what you would do probably in a real-life physical environment, you could dedicate to this tenant VLAN 2, 3, and 4 with edges backing those, and then you can have another organization with VLAN 5, 6, and 7 backed by these other edge devices. Going back to your point, it would be nice to do something like this, but it could not be done today, right? But this is pretty much the idea. Very traditional way to do things, right? So we're basically doing the things in the physical world and bringing them into the virtual world. But we can go a little bit more naive, if you will. So we can, for example, continue to use edge, because app is, I don't trust app, for whatever reason. It's a big change and it needs to be digested. Okay? So you want to continue to use, for example, edge as a separation between the external network and the organization network, but you may want to optimize the network infrastructure. You don't want to, quote-to-quote, waste 3 VLANs for each tenant. So you could associate 1 VLAN per each tenant, and you can use VCDNI or VLAN virtualization technologies to create different port groups that are different layer 2 domains that are sharing the very same VLAN. Okay? Because this service provider is concerned about putting the very same customer on a VLAN with another one, basically what you could do is you could dedicate another VLAN to another customer here. Okay? But giving this customer, in this example, 3, but it could be 10, 20 different layer 2 domains, wasting just 1 VLAN. Okay? Maybe there is another cloud administrator that is a little bit more aggressive in the way they would like to optimize the data center, and maybe they want to do something like this. Okay? So instead of using edge for that specific tenant, they want to use vShield app. Why would they want to do this? Because they are saving on port groups. In this case, they are just deploying one single port group with VLAN number 3 that is going to back or do the organization number 2, which is tenant, Dr. Pepper, if it's a public cloud, or an internal business unit, if it's a private cloud. And they are going to create these enclaves to separate, for example, web, database, application, and the number of workloads that need separation from a security perspective. Okay? And then you can go even more naive and aggressive, which would be the ultimate goal in this case, where what we are doing here is we are still backing each organization with the edge device, because you need to have the edge device. But what happens within the organization, within the virtual data center, is that we are sharing the very same VLAN. So I'm basically using one VLAN to support multiple tenants in my infrastructure. Each VLAN represents a port group on the physical vSphere infrastructure, and I'm using vShield app to create these security zones. Okay? So I hope that it makes kind of sense, right? So depending on where you are in terms of maturity, in terms of internal politics, because we have seen tons of internal politics on how to do things, you may tune and you may choose the technology that better fits your level of maturity in the cloud. You can really do, really the things that you could do today in the physical environment, and you bring them in a virtual cloud environment. Or you can go very much, down the optimization path with these technologies here. Oops. So we're going towards the end of this. How do they fit together from a architecture perspective? Okay, so this slide is pretty complex, but it shows basically the vSphere shared infrastructure underneath here, which is again your bread and butter, and then we show vCloud Director on top of here. So we have out-of-the-box portal, and then we have the APIs as we discussed. Okay, so the way it works basically is that we map vCenter because we need to map vCenter to create these, the provider VDC and to consume the CPU, memory, and all this kind of stuff. From within vCloud Director, what we also do is we map the vShield Manager. You remember, vShield Manager is kind of vCenter for the security part. Obviously, vShield Manager has APIs, so whatever you can do in the UI of vShield Manager is exposed through the APIs. And what we have done is basically through vCloud Director 1.5, we are consuming these APIs. Because, as I said, the self-service mode, when you create a vApp network, when you do certain things, basically what happens is that vCloud Director goes and talks to vShield Manager, and it starts to deploy this kind of stuff. So how can we provide self-service mode, NAT, firewall, DHCP, and this kind of stuff for the end user? That's very simple. We take vCloud APIs call over here, we translate them into vShield APIs, and we apply that end user configuration to this vShield Edge device. That's how it works today. Okay? Obviously, we are not done in the sense that we're not basically overlaying everything in the vShield APIs. So we have a few things that are left out today, namely load balancing. So I'm sure you missed that. I went very quickly, but vShield Edge can do these 5 things: NAT, firewall, DHCP, VPN, and load balancing. Today, we're not exposing load balancing through the vCloud interface because we are only consuming these 4 APIs from a configuration perspective. Similarly, today, we are not consuming the vShield app APIs. You remember when I said when you do app, you lose the self-service mode? That's because we are not consuming those API here. Of course, our will is to consume all of those APIs so that everything becomes self-service from a functionality perspective. Today, it is not, so that you have actually 2 options if you want to do all of this functionality. The first one is that you need to provide this functionality as a managed services, which is a term that it's probably more used in the service provider space, but basically it gives the idea that it's not the end user, the consumer, that can do this configuration, but it's basically the cloud admin that can do that. Or the other option is to create a custom portal which does this for you. So basically a custom portal so that you have your end user coming into this portal rather than these APIs and this VCD portal, so that you can call either the vCloud APIs or these other APIs where it is needed. So potentially, you could, in theory, create your own portal, which is much better than the out-of-the-box VCD portal. Which, to be honest, is not a very tough challenge. Okay? Is there any question on this? Yeah. Yeah. So basically what happens here is that in the vCloud APIs that are accessible by the consumer here, we do not expose features like load balancing or firewall configuration through app. You as a cloud administrator, which usually is the same as the vSphere administrator, you can access this API either through the vShield a manager UI or API, and that's why I said that it could be a managed service. So the end user has to pick up the phone, call you and say, can you create me an enclave for these other bunch of VMs? And you would go here via UI or API, and you would create for him on the port group that he owns an enclave with app. Okay? Good. So last sorry. Question.
Just a quick question on the load balancing. That is not SSL offload, or you can't put SSL on there. It's just round robin or...
To be honest, the load balancing, one of the reasons for which we're not probably exposing it today is a little bit limited. It only balances port 80, so it's pretty limited, right? Obviously, we're working on expanding support for the load balancer, but today, even if you do the things that I was showing you, which is the managed service or the porta, blah, blah, the load balancing functionality of vShield Edge are just port 80, so pretty limited. A couple of slides on VXL LAN that you heard yesterday. Basically, I mean, this doesn't probably add a lot of details compared to what you heard yesterday, but it gives you more thought about where this could really be used. Lots of customers that we met, both in the service provider space as well as enterprise customers, that have multiple problems. The first one is intra-data center separation of the network infrastructure, and obviously multiple sites that are connected over layer 3 or whatever, right? And this resulted in a few limitations from a vSphere perspective, which is if you have a VM on this cluster here, which is connected to, say, VLAN 1. Again, VLAN 1 is not a good example, but just to give you an idea of 3 different VLANs, you can't really do anything. You can't really move it to the other, part of the data center because there are other VLANs, there is another IP address schema, and go figure if you can move it to the other side, right? Obviously, totally different VLAN, totally different schema. So what VXLAN is all about, if you think about this, not to get into the technology aspect, is we want to actually add an abstraction layer, which is something that we are good at, I think. So most of the people, I've seen comments on Twitter and blogs where they say, that is not your domain. I mean, what are you doing with the network? You are not a network company. I think that we are using lots of the concept that we have been using in the compute space. Maybe they don't translate into the very same technologies, but lots of the concept that we have been using in the compute space, like adding an additional abstraction layer, which probably, if you think about this, I mean, storage DRS and vMotion and all this kind of stuff are really similar, even though applied to another domain. But basically, the idea is to add this abstraction layer so that you can really connect to different VLANs connected, for example, at layer 3, and you could create a virtual layer 2 that has an address schema that is consistent across all of the VLANs that you have underneath. So what that means is that you can potentially move your VMs from one side to the other or from one cluster to the other inside the very same data center, even though the cluster number 19 doesn't get the same VLAN that that VM has on cluster number 2. So I cannot really move it without re-IPing it. Okay, so and obviously this opens up a number of use cases like inside flexibility, DR, and obviously hybrid cloud. One of the problems that we have today with hybrid cloud is that you can take a VM, you can put it into the public cloud, but you have to change the IP, right? Well, you could in theory not change the IP, but you need to fence it. So at the end of the day, you need to change the IP, right? With this one, you could actually do things that it's pretty amazing. I think that VXLAN is one of the things that is going to change the way we think about this kind of stuff. So we're pretty done. I think we are close to the hour. There was a question. You're free to leave. Oh, remember to fill out the survey, please, because they're important to us. Thanks. Thank you.